Hello. All right, welcome. We'll get your names down. Okay, I was going to send you guys an announcement. You guys are next on my list of catching up with grading, okay? So thank you and sorry it's taken me this long. So I want to go over two. The second one I'm not quite finished with, but the thesis will remain consistent. All right. So you could be assured that whatever we do go over, the rest of it will be to that end. All right. All right. So what I want to do is go to the one that you're doing now. Let's see here. That's not it. That's the one I'm working on. This one right here. All right. So hopefully you all can see that. So the one you're working on right now is the generic Gilded Age, giving you the historical context to like the surrounding situation, to the Latinos' plight during the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was the time of our second great industrial revolution. The gross national product more than quadrupled. The value of all goods being produced in the nation. You look at like the macro data as far as how much wealth, how much like I said, value in goods are being produced and sold and bought. We exploded, right? It's our greater of the two industrial revolutions. But there was a guy named Henry George, and Henry George was saying at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, he said, this is going to be very bittersweet. All right. Our country is going to become unrecognizable in the differences that will accrue. But he said, not everyone is going to equally benefit from this revolution. And nothing could be further from the truth, according to a lot of historians. All right. So I kind of take that negative bent of his on a lot of what we're doing in the next two assignments. Okay. So I have here section number 1. Karl Marx was right. Capitalism is an unfair economic system rigged for the rich. All right. And so what I do is I try to show the unfair advantages that the wealthy had over the less privileged. Okay. So it's pretty upfront. And so one of the first things I do is I get into the public corporation. Going public as a corporation, you have to hit certain criteria or else everyone would do it. But in doing so, you open yourself up to investors from all over the world, right? Who get to engage in limited liability speculation or betting, if you will, right? So you buy a couple shares, you get just a couple shares of the profit. Okay. If the company goes under, you are not responsible for it. You're just a public speculator buying public stock, and you only run the risk of losing the amount of money that you engaged in to buy however many numbers of stock or what percentage of stock that you bought. All right. So you have these multinational corporations that go public, and it just gives them a lot of capital, a lot of money to begin with. All right, that the smaller guys don't have access to. So for one of the main avenues for toward their success, I might make the argument for, is streamlining production. All right, I think of like Rockefeller. Rockefeller secured enough loans and became public and got enough investors to give him money so that he could find ways to cut in half. And at one point, he even did more than in half his costs of production. So, he didn't want to rely upon anybody for any facet of his production. So he owned the land over the oil, the subterranean crude oil. He bought the oil derricks to extract it. Then he used his own barrels to get to put the crude oil into. Okay, so he didn't have to pay someone else to do that. Then he also very shrewdly put his the alignment of the place from the crude oil to his refinery. He oftentimes gave himself from 2 to 4 different options of people, whether it be by shipping, like literally shipping, or by railroad to get it there. And what he did is, as he became more and more bountiful in his possession of oil, is he would make the 4 different competitors compete by lowering their prices for how much they were willing to extract from him, to demand of him for oil. So he'd get him to go down to a certain amount, like 33 cents a pound, let's say. So because they would get paid per pound. So even if they gave him a lower price than other people, they were still making so much money because of the amount of oil and the number of pounds that they were able to charge him for, right? So it's supposed to be a win-win situation. So he controlled the path to his refineries. He controlled the refineries, obviously. He had about a dozen byproducts made from the refining process, from crude oil to refined oil. They had like a surplus of, like discharged or offal, like remaining stuff that was coming out of the vats. And he didn't want to waste that. And so he found ways to turn those byproducts into products that he sold on the side. So he could also make money on that. Then in addition to that, and refining them, he also had more than one option that he could go to the final markets on the East Coast from Cleveland to sell the refined oil. So he controlled every facet of the production, and that's known as vertical integration. And if you had the money to do that, it was a great thing because it greatly cut your costs. Okay. Then in addition to that, as a means to that, only the big corporations had the money on the side to spend on research and development. And that's where those are his guys that found the extra resources in the byproducts and found ways to cut short and cheapen the process of refining the oil through different machinery, different methods that they tried, etc., and were eventually successful. So when that's all done, right, he not only has economies of scale, he has so many billions of pounds of oil to sell that it adds up tremendously. But he also has saved himself so much money in the production process that his lesser competitors were unable to do, that he can put a lower price on his oil and undersell his competitors. And then it's just a self-enriching process, right? That once people start buying his oil over others, he gets even a stronger monstrosity of an advantage over all the other oil producers. So much so that he ends up providing over 90% of the nation's oil. All right. So a lot of these industries ended up turning into monopolies or near monopolies with just 1, 2, maybe 3 major competitors nationwide. And the railroads have connected all the different markets and people together. And so now the small guys are having to compete with this. And of course, according to this narrative, they can't. They just can't. All right. So then you have horizontal integration when you buy up your competitors. What he would do, right, is he got into a comfortable enough of a situation whereby he would say, okay, I noticed that and he would do his homework. He'd ask about your grandkids. He'd know their names, etc. Ask how your grandkids are doing with your mom and pop oil refinery. And then he'd say, okay, I noticed that you made 300,000 last year. He says, I'll tell you what, I have the machinery and you don't to extract much more oil from where you're sitting on. Let me take this headache from you. You take an early retirement, and I will give you an 8% share in my company. And last year, of course, I made over $1 billion. And yes, that was back then. And so that you could sit back and make even more money, or just as much, if not more money, sitting back in as a shareholder in my company, and give me the headache of running your company. Well, quite a few competitors took that deal. But the problem is if you didn't want to, if it was your passion, if your family identity was tied up in that business, and there was no amount of money that you were willing to part with that company, then they said he would give you this look like a shark, like he was measuring you and seeing what you were worth as far as your grit and your fight and your resources, and he'd go to war with you. He would suggest, for instance, like on the railroads, he not only made them compete for his services, but for his oil, but he also would use his wealth and buy a majority share of their stocks, and thereby be able to sit on their governing board of their railroad. So then, of course, you have a conflict of interest, but there was nothing against the law at that time for that. So he could cut himself rebates and do what he wanted with the oil that the railroad company, for whom he's sitting as a board member now, as a major shareholder, there was no problem in that kind of conflict of interest. Well, he would tell the person, I'll make sure that they do not ship your oil. I'll tell them my oil or yours. And of course, they would always side with Rockefeller because they have so many more pounds of oil that they could charge him for, that they could make more money off of him than the average Joe. And so he had ways of manipulating people to force them to merge with his big company. And then on his way up, he did a deal known as a Lakeshore deal, whereby he combined his crude oil with a competitor's crude oil. And, it was just under the assumption of capitalism that it's each man for himself and that everyone is a competitor. But he would team up at times and say, okay, let's team up. I promised the railroad, if I could give them 6 tons of oil per week, that they would give me a 40% discount. And they would even tell them at that beginning stage, you can't provide 6 tons a week. And he said, you let me worry about that part. If I can provide you 6 tons a week that you could charge me for, will you give me a 40% rebate? And they said, yes, of course we would. So he teams up with a rival. They put their oil together. They both receive that rebate known as the Lakeshore deal. And then they separate their oil at the refinery. And so then you had cases in which he would have one man standing with him on the East Coast with his oil, right? And they would gouge one another in prices, lower their prices to try to undersell the other. And he'd get together with them from time to time and say, wait a minute, we're both losing money unnecessarily. We're both the strongest men standing in providing the oil to the East Coast. Let's promise to not lower our price more than such and such a pound. And we'll put it at the same price, and then it's fair. Well, today, those would be violations of the antitrust laws. That's just unfair. You can't collude. You can't collaborate like that, make your own secret deals on prices and stuff like that anymore. But there was no law against it at the time. But to suggest that he knew that there was something unethical about doing that when he made such deals, almost without exception, he refused to sign his name to them. He'd say, my handshake will suffice. So it's as if he knew deep down that he was doing something in somewhat shady fashion. All right. So Rockefeller is usually the example I use with this type of unfair advantage over the small guys. So you see here, small scale would-be entrepreneurs or business owners chasing the American dream in the oil, steel, or other industry monopolized by the Titans didn't stand a chance. All right. So that's when the critics began calling them robber barons, likening them to the barons of Germany, who as barons would force people an exorbitantly high amount of money to cross their rivers and to go into certain areas to trade, etc. And so that was a derogatory remark that stuck in the press about them as envy and resentment gained hold of much of America. All right. With the Erie Railroad, you had a guy named Jay Gould, and he bought a majority of shares under phony names. And then after he had bought what amounted to a majority, he came forth as it being him with those phony names. So precisely so, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was trying to have a trunk line of connected railroads from the East Coast into the Great Lakes. He wanted to be the sole owner of the railroads from that entire juncture. And Jay Gould kind of bought it from underneath his nose in the Erie Railroad War under fake names. And so they tried one way or another to try to outspend each other. They took each other to court. And then when Jay Gould went to court, the legend states that he fled New York to New Jersey and secretly met a judge in a hotel room where he opened up a briefcase of $1 million to bribe him. So it's just crazy stuff that's going on at this time. So James Duke pretty much monopolized tobacco. Cyrus McCormick pretty much monopolized farm equipment. Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, his Bethlehem and then U.S. Steel, right? Carnegie, he went to back to Scotland, where he was from, and he brought back Bessemer ovens, Henry Bessemer's process of oxidizing iron into much more durable steel in a very cheap, quick manner. And so he quickly not only brought them here, but as soon as he got some that worked well, he earned the patent on them so that no one could copy his exact Bessemer ovens. And so he took off with iron and steel production. Okay. J.P. Morgan with railroads eventually. Before that, financing. Let's see here. Jay Gould, the guy I mentioned, buying the phony stock. Not the phony stock, but stock under phony names. He was a giant who manipulated the stock market. And the list goes on and on. So at any rate, you see here, thus hundreds of mergers occurred a month in which many smaller companies were either given incentives to sell their companies or were bullied into doing so. From 1897 to 1904, for instance, 1,800 companies merged into only 157. So you have this centralization, this trend of horizontal integration, of big companies buying out all their competitors. Then for the average person, when the rise and fall of the market, right? When you had a steep decline in purchases of whatever you're producing, you're not going to allow, right? Just pounds and pounds of your product to just sit idly in the factory and then continue to pay your workers to make even more of them, right? No, what you're going to do is you're going to lay your workers off, at least for a time being. So the average worker during the Gilded Age was laid off 1 to 3 times a year, where they'd go a month, 2, 3 months, without a job, without income, because their boss's stuff was not being bought at that time. A lot of people also experienced a glass ceiling. And the glass ceiling is that it's glass and that there's not an actual law, right? The state law or a corporate law that says that you can't be promoted, you can't ever earn a raise, etc. They just didn't do it. They just didn't do it. So a lot of people stayed stuck in that position. And remember, the fancy word for that is proletarianization. Karl Marx's proletariat are the manual laborers of the industrial era, who are doing the hard, back-breaking work with their hands. And a lot of them were stuck in the positions in which they were. We became, according to Howard Zinn, #1 in the nation for industrial accidents. So the working conditions were dangerous, especially in mining, etc. Okay, and gas inhalation. So then look at this. According to historian Howard Zinn, the wealthiest 1% of the nation at this time owned over 70% of the wealth and assets, and over 10 million people lived under the poverty line in the country. The average working class male earning only between $400 and $500 per year, when historians generally agree that an income of at least $600 per year was necessary for basic sustenance or living. Right? And then Alan Brinkley, who's not as Marxist as Howard Zinn is, even he says here, concludes that few workers were ever far from poverty. And there was no safety net legislation. There were no mandated, labor laws, labor union laws, in which labor unions had to be recognized, and you had to engage in collective bargaining with the union reps over, the rising cost of living. So to have your wages go up with a rising cost of living, for instance, workers' compensation if you got hurt at the job and couldn't work for a while, nothing like that in the form of safety net legislation. So you see there, you have people like Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Jay Gould, who were kind of running the show. Then I didn't want to play devil. I wanted to play devil's advocate, give the devil his due, so to speak. And I say there is a degree to which conservatives could argue that some of these men, quote, earned their success. And when you look at this, the two guys I look at are Rockefeller and Carnegie. So Rockefeller was extremely frugal. He had a great reputation for paying back his loans, and that's why at key pivotal points he got several loans at once, because their faith in him that he would pay them back. Rockefeller seldom slept, was always a perfectionist and wanting to improve and expedite and truncate the amount spent on production. And so, he worked for all of that. He certainly did. Carnegie had a great reputation as far as his personality. Mr. Scott was instrumental in his skyrocketed rise. Mr. Scott thought the world of him at the O'Reilly Telegraph Company, and talked him into moving to the Pennsylvania Railroad from the O'Reilly Telegraph Company. He talked him into making a couple purchases in stock that got him his first kind of nest of wealth. And then he made key pivotal decisions at key times under Mr. Scott in the Pennsylvania Railroad to get him the raise and the rise up there. Not only just the rise for Pennsylvania Railroad, but then when he went rogue and went for his own Carnegie Steel Company, Mr. Scott was the first one to put trust and put money into his company. Oftentimes was his first great client who would buy the steel rails for his Pennsylvania Railroad from Carnegie in his new company. So with Carnegie, it was like winning over the right people. Really helped him out. And making shrewd decisions as well. Right? And then number 3 is a bit like number 1, whereas number 1 implies that capitalism is kind of this like godless Darwinian system where the big gobble up the small. Number 3 is even more cynical in saying that the government of all factions to side with, the government actually sides with the wealthy corporate giants. That's what a plutocracy is. It's ruled by the wealthy who have the government in their pockets. So I try to show you on number 3 evidence of the government going out of its way to keep people from regulating the big businesses. All right. Firstly, the government decided to identify corporations as individuals. And to me, that's still strange. So hence the 14th Amendment, the right of all individuals to all the rights, privileges, and protections of citizenship. It's strange to me that they would count modern corporations as an individual. And it seems like they're going out of their way to help the modern corporations. Then you have these different state laws that try to put a price ceiling on the middlemen, like the shippers, the railroad shippers, the storage companies for people's farm produce. They were charging them whatever they wanted, and they were giving rebates to the big guys, but not to the little guys, because the little guys had nothing to offer them. They didn't have high enough of a quantity, enough pounds to impose their will on these middlemen. So the middlemen instead stuck it to them and gave them higher prices than they did the big corporate guys to store or to ship their stuff. So state after state established Granger laws, as they were called, putting a price ceiling on how much those middlemen could charge. And the federal courts took it in their hands and stated that that constitutes regulating interstate trade, and that if any of those corporations do trade across the state line, then no state has jurisdiction to regulate them. And of course, most of these big corporations did do business across state lines, so it kept them impervious to these state laws trying to regulate what they could charge. So again, the federal government looks like it's helping out the wealthy guys. And then I suggest that if it really truly weren't about class loyalty, because let's face it, a lot of the judges and a lot of the federal leaders were of the wealthy class, like the robber barons. If it truly were an ideological thing, where they just wanted the government to be laissez-faire and let the economy do its thing, let people make their own decisions, their own business decisions, etc., then why do they have protective tariffs? That's not laissez-faire. Okay, to protect our manufacturers against import competitors. And so then, like I said, you had the Granger laws. They struck those down. So finally, the federal government gives in and issues the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. And it states that no company should engage in charging any rates that are unreasonable. I think they literally use that adjective, unreasonable. But they give the federal government no enforcement mechanism to carry it out. So it's just on paper. And again, is that evidence that the government was plutocratic, was in favor of the rich, and didn't really want to regulate the rich. And they simply are trying to just placate, trying to make happy the common rush of anger amongst the regular American people by just putting a law on paper. And then in addition to that, they had the Sherman antitrust law. And the Sherman antitrust law says that no conspiracies shall be made in restraint of free trade and competition. Again, that sounds nice, but very vague, perhaps deliberately vague, and it wasn't enforced. And then in addition to that, you had two railroad strikes in 1877, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and in 1894, the Pullman Strike, that went across a number of states and territories, right? Well, what did the federal government do? The federal government intervened with federal troops against the workers, against the strikers, to keep them from violence and to keep them from destruction of property. Now, granted, there was violence and there was destruction of property, but it still seems blatantly there for the robber barons. So Richard Olney, he was a Secretary of State, and he was a major investor in one of the railroads that was being hijacked by the strikers. So his investment in that railroad's stock was imperiled by this strike and by the destruction of the strike. So what does he do? He uses his political position to get the Supreme Court to issue an injunction that states that the strike is technically legally illegal at this point. But again, you think, of course he did. He had money involved. And of course, they went against the workers. All right. So look at these like political cartoons here. That was supposed to be, I believe, the Granger movement or labor unions. This guy on this tired, almost donkey, emaciated horse. And of course, you see there written on the gilded, armory of the iron horse, the railroad horse, right, is the term monopoly. So the organized workers didn't stand a chance. Okay. So I'm going to read the intro because I make it pretty clear what I'm trying to convey here on this one that I'm not quite finished with. I want to write some data on California. I have data in Arizona and New Mexico so far. Why Arizona and New Mexico? Why California? Because that's where the largest demographic of Latinos were in the 1870s through 1890s. Okay. Court history of the United States Gilded Age would encompass praise for the titans of industry, highlighting their efforts in diversifying the economy, bringing order and structure to commerce, providing jobs for millions of Americans, fine-tuning the quality of their manufactured products, and raising the nation's gross national product, right? Annual value of goods and services produced in the nation. Conversely, conflict history would depict them as privileged parasites, who received unfair advantages from government, who enriched themselves off their exploited laborers, and who buried their smaller scale competitors. Finally, functional history would not search for heroes, villains, or victims, simply stating how each demographic played its part in helping the economy and society function as it does. Even a cursory look at the historical data of Latinos during the Gilded Age ought to convince historians to create a narrative in conflict history fashion. All right. So I have Rodolfo Acuna. His book I heavily use. I say that it coincides well with Mark Twain's Gilded Age depiction of the era, glittery and impressive on first sight, but corroded under the surface upon closer scrutiny. Okay, so now I'm going to show how Arizona, how the Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution, hit Arizona. Arizona received San Francisco bankers, right? Federally subsidized programs to utilize scarce water sources for irrigated farming, railroad lines to connect markets and laborers, etc. And East Coast, as well as foreign investors and entrepreneurs to get copper mining attached to a national market. On the surface, cotton and copper exports increased tenfold. The population of Arizona more than doubled in a decade. And the number of people engaging in commercial enterprises grew from only 591 people with a business to, in 1870, to 3,252 people in business in 1880. So again, on the surface, that looks great. However, on closer observation, international giants like Copper Queen Mining and the Phelps Dodge Company pushed smaller copper competitors out of business. Money required for mechanized farming rendered all but the well-connected unable to keep up. San Francisco bankers were highly selective in their desire to make only safe loans to wealthy farmers. And the federal and state governments subsidized efforts to channel river water to farms, coincidentally, primarily provided irrigation assistance to Euro-American, that's like white American, corporate farmers and ranchers. Consequently, as Arizona began to integrate with the Industrial Revolution under the 3 Cs, cattle, copper, and cotton, fewer and fewer people of Mexican descent controlled production. In fact, Latinos now comprised the majority of unskilled laborers in industries like Arizona mining, the Anaconda Mining Company, almost solely employing unskilled Mexican laborers. Howard Zinn, in fact, states that leaders of Anaconda crushed the Mexican laborers' attempts at strikes. Likewise, in New Mexico, historian Rodolfo Acuna contends that the usual advantages wealthy Euro-Americans enjoyed were exacerbated. They were made worse by, they already had an advantage with money, but now it's made worse by naked corruption and violence. In New Mexico, as in Arizona, the mechanization of corporate farming, right, using like the mechanical reaper, the mechanical thresher, the harvester combine, those are super expensive machines to farm with. Could not be competed with by small-scale farmers unable to afford such farm machinery. To supplement this Euro-American advantage, a Santa Fe ring was established of predominantly Anglo lawyers, politicians, political machine leaders of the 2 national parties, bankers, and businessmen. They formed a cabal, like almost like a conspiracy, a little unit that were in it for themselves only. They formed a cabal to monopolize power and resources for themselves. They rigged elections. They chose provisional governors and judges who were in their pockets and manipulated the law in New Mexico in their favor. They hired rustlers to steal sheep and cattle. They sent squatters onto Native American communal land and rancheros, Hispanics, ranchero land property, to initiate the selling of their land, granted squatters' rights to them, then paid them to initiate land sales of the undisputed property. Ultimately, such tactics effected or brought about the loss of 1.7 million acres of communal land and 2 million in rancheros lands. 80% of the New Mexican land grants went to members of this Santa Fe ring. Latinos could not represent themselves in court due to the People versus Elia case in 1857, which forbade the court's acceptance of Latinos' testimony on account of their Native American blood. Leaders of the Santa Fe ring monopolized contracts with government, like selling beef to reservations and military forts, and bankers' business, and taking the lion's share of loans for capital and purchasing land and buying farm equipment. When the ring turned on the poor squatters, racism kept the Anglo squatters from teaming up with their Latino counterparts. Because for a while there were some poor, desperate white farmers squatting on land who were in the same position as the Latinos. But because of racism, they didn't unite. By the time President Rutherford B. Hayes intervened against the Santa Fe ring and naming his own territorial governor, the damage had been done. Latino leaders like Juan Patron had been murdered by Lawrence Murphy's ringmen, known as the Lincoln County War. That's the same one of Billy the Kid was in. And the Mexican competitors for cattle, sheep, cotton, land, and water had been, quote, eliminated by the 1880s. And I'm going to have more on the economics on California. Such economic marginalization, remember marginalization, you're kicked to the corner and you're not included, the same opportunities and rights don't apply to you. Such economic marginalization did not constitute the totality of Latinos' woes, for they were socially or culturally pigeonholed into the proletariat and dispossession on account of a popular decision to amalgamate sentiment toward them into an already existent racist pathos toward African Americans. The same stereotypes they had of African Americans, they're going to apply to Latinos. In 1904, an angry Arizona mob of Anglo Americans attacked Catholic nuns and Mexican families to whom they were entrusting East Coast orphans. Known as the Great Orphan Abduction, this episode began when Catholic nuns in New York, wanting to eschew controversy and putting Catholic orphans into Italian or Irish homes, sentiments against those demographics, Irish and Italians, was low indeed, chose instead to send the orphan children to Latino Catholics in Arizona. Apprised of the situation, Arizona Anglos quickly formed a mob and at gunpoint took the orphan children from their new Latino parents. Their accusations spoke volumes of their stereotypical image of Latinos, that the dads might sexually assault the children, that the children would grow up in ignorance and filth, that the nuns sell for 30 pieces of silver to Catholic parents constituted a deal with the devil, right? Like selling off Judas's payment to betray Jesus. Assuming Latino men were lecherous and dangerous, that they were ignorant, and that their families felt at home living in sloth, Gilded Age Anglo-Americans were ascribing long-held stereotypes of African Americans, known as the Sambo image, against African Americans, and new beliefs about new immigrants onto the Latino people. All right. So whatever I add to this, it's going to be along the same thesis. I won't change my message, but I just might put a little bit more data in here. All right. So are there any questions? All right. Do you guys feel okay about this? All right, guys, that's it. That's it for today. That's it for this week. We've done the 2 assignments on the Gilded Age. All right, and yeah, that'll do it for this this segment.
Bye. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.